Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Rohr, and I'm the Manager of Academic Programs and Outreach at JDC Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar sponsored by the JDC Archives in the context of the Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship Program. We are thrilled that so many of you have joined us this afternoon. Our speaker today, Dr. Michal Ben-Yaakov, was awarded the Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship for 2019. The Fred and Ellen Lewis Fellowship was initiated in 2012 in tribute of Ellen Lewis. Our speaker today, Michal Ben-Yaakov, is a Spiegel Fellow of the Arnold and Leona Finkler Institute of Holocaust Research at Bar-Ilan University. Previously, she was an Associate Professor of History at the Ephrata College of Education in Jerusalem. She was also the founding director of its unique graduate program in memory, heritage, and education. Her principal areas of research deal with Middle Eastern Jews in Palestine and North Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. Her work focuses on the history of women in these communities, on migration, and on the Jews in North Africa during World War II. She has published over 40 articles and edited 4 volumes. Her recent publications include Women and the War, the Social and Economic Impact of World War I on Jewish Women in the Traditional Holy Cities of Palestine, which was published in Marsha Rosenblit and Jonathan Karp volume, World War I and the Jews, Conflict and Transformations in Europe, the Middle East, and America. Her current project at the JDC Archives continues her previous research on JDC activities in Morocco during World War II and explores the perceptions of American Jews regarding North African Jews. Our format is that our guest speaker will talk for about 45 minutes. She will then answer questions. Your microphones are mute and we'll be taking your questions via the Q&A function. You are welcome to send your questions at any time during the lecture. Michal will now start her lecture.
Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are. I begin with thanks to the donors and the facilitators of the Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship, to Dr. Isabel Rohr for facilitating my work in New York, and to Dr. Anat Kutner in Jerusalem. Although I had planned to see many of you today in person in New York, travel and meetings are now impossible. But today's technology has opened this lecture to a wider audience with your virtual participation, although it's a bit odd lecturing without seeing you. I am presenting here a work in progress, so your questions and comments will be welcomed at the end of the lecture or after. The final slide will include my email address, and I do promise to respond. And so we begin. The exotic names of song and story, Algiers, the Barbary Coast, Tripoli, lose some of their magic luster as the advance of the British and American forces exposed them to harsh reality, wrote Louis Borenstein in the JDC Digest barely a month after the Allied invasion of North Africa in November 1942. While the focus of American Jews during World War II was clearly centered on the unfolding tragedy of the Holocaust and US military operations, American Jews began to encounter Jews in North Africa. What was this magic luster that Borenstein wrote about? How did it affect the perceptions of American Jews and their images of North African Jews? How did the stereotypes of American Orientalism influence American Jews, most with roots in Central or Eastern Europe? I asked further, did they consider the Jews from Islamic countries as an integral part of world Jewry, or were they regarded as exotic in far-flung communities outside normative Jewry? As American Jews' truncated views of world Jewry encountered the realities of Moroccan Jewish life during World War II, American Jews were challenged during the war and in the post-war decade. From a variety of sources, I will try to tease out the images and perceptions which American Jews held regarding Moroccan Jewry as an outstanding example of Jews in Arab lands in general, and will argue that these views impacted on philanthropic aid and social assistance. Today, most of my talk will center on the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, or the Joint, as one of the prime movers in the area representing American Jews in Morocco. First, a few words about early encounters. European colonial presence in Morocco increased during the 19th century, and Jews in England, Germany, and particularly France became interested in their co-religionists in Morocco. Their concern manifested itself in diplomatic, philanthropic, and educational projects to improve the situation of the Jews in line with Western Enlightenment ideals and the imperialistic enterprises of their countries. In 1862, Moroccan Jewry clearly moved into the European orbit when the newly found Alliance Israélite Universelle, the AIU, or the Alliance, established the first of many schools in Tétouan, using education to promote its goals of Jewish social and political equality and economic advancement for the unenlightened masses. Modern Jewish diplomacy was extended to Moroccan Jews, beginning with the 1864 trip to Morocco of the Sephardic British promoter of Jewish rights, Sir Moses Montefiore, with the explicit purpose of requesting fair treatment of the Jews. While this intervention had no positive practical consequences for the Jews in Morocco, reports of the journey did bring their plight to the attention of broader Jewish audiences, including those in the United States, and reinforced a sense of worldwide Jewish solidarity and responsibility. Compared to European nations, the United States and American Jews were much less involved in North African affairs. Michael Oren, in his popular 2007 book, Power, Faith, and Fantasy, America in the Middle East, has noted over 2 centuries of encounters between the United States and North Africa in diplomatic and economic spheres. Although Oren's focus is not on Jews, Jews play a distinct role. American Jews were often appointed representatives in North Africa, seen as a natural bridge, and local Jews were engaged to expedite American activities, a phenomenon common in many European countries as well. However, this did not translate into further connections between the Jews of the United States and those of Morocco. In times of war and distress in Morocco, limited funds were collected by B'nai B'rith, for example, which had close ideological ties to the French Alliance and to the Anglo-Jewish Association in England. And most financial assistance was channeled through them. At the turn of the 20th century, American Jewish leaders began to enter the field of Jewish diplomacy. The foremost New York Jewish banker, financier, philanthropist, and communal leader of the time, Jacob Schiff, justified its intervention, noting, quote, "While most Mohammedan countries, the position of the Jews has been favorable, this did not hold true in Morocco, where they, the Jews, were subjected to oppression and degradation as severe as that during the Middle Ages in Europe." A handful of articles about Moroccan Jews appeared in the Jewish and general press in the United States, focusing on the discrimination and injustices to the Jews, with little notice of their communal life or rich traditions. The New York Times, for example, published short articles as, in October 1880, "Persecution of the Jews in Morocco," and in April 1910, "Oppressed Jews in Morocco seek aid." A few American Jews did actually travel in the region, meet the people themselves, and describe these communities and the rich cultures. Other travels emphasized those they met as exotic and far-flown. The young Cyrus Adler, next slide please, for example, later one of the founders of the JDC, was commissioned by Congress to travel to Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and Turkey in 1891 in order to obtain their participation in the World's Columbian Exposition to be held in Chicago. He vividly described his visits to the Jewish communities in contemporary newspaper articles and later in his 1941 autobiography. In the words of a 1942 biography eulogy, it was written, "This experience of his travels undoubtedly influenced his later activities. During World War I, American Jews and their organizations increased their overseas activities and further broadened them after the war. In 1914, they established the JDC with emergency aid directed towards Eastern Europe and Palestine. However, American Jews and their organizations had little concern for the Jews in Morocco, a country far from their consciousness, lacking any personal family ties or even general knowledge of the region. During the interwar period, American Jews were barely cognizant of the changes taking place in Moroccan Jewish society and its increasingly influential westernized sector. And scant attention was paid to the Jews of Morocco, even though North African Jews increasingly participated in international Jewish conventions as the Zionist Congresses and the World Jewish Congress. Moreover, with the establishment of the French Protectorate in Morocco in 1912 and the official recognition of the Alliance activities there, American Jews and their leaders accepted the enlightened French hegemony in the area and rarely intervened. Until 1939, the JDC expended no more than a few $100s annually in all of the countries of North Africa. By the late 1930s, Jews in the United States had become quite Americanized, and the majority of Jews were American-born rather than immigrants. They had received public school education and participated in the overall cultural life of the country. While retraining their Jewish identity, they had become immersed in American popular culture, which, among other things, fantasized about the East. They read the popular 1001 Arabian Nights, watched newsreels and read Lowell Thomas's With Lawrence in Arabia, and a proliferation of spy stories evoking the Middle East. Next, please. They gazed at Cleopatra's Needle in Central Park in Manhattan, reveled in reports of the treasures discovered in King Tut's tomb in 1922, and watched popular movies. Next, please. From the 1921 silent film The Sheikh, starring Rudolph Valentino, to Paramount Pictures' 1937 cartoon Popeye the Sailor meets Alibaba's 40 Thieves, followed 2 years later by Popeye and Aladdin and his wonderful lamb. And all these you can see on YouTube. I don't have time to show you short clips here. Coinciding with the 1942 Allied invasion of North Africa, the all-time favorite Casablanca and the inane Bing Crosby, Bob Hope, and Dorothy Lamour production Road to Morocco. Quote, "Few parts of the world has become as deeply embedded in U.S. popular imagination as the Middle East," notes Douglas Little in the opening of his book entitled American Orientalism. These American fantasies of Islamic lands and cultures ignored the differences between Casablanca in the west and Baghdad some 3,000 miles to the east, lumping everybody and every place together as the East or the Orient, which only after World War II signified Eastern Europe for Americans. Although American Orientalism does not share Europe's unconcealed colonial context, common to both are the categorizing of the other, Jew or Muslim, as primitive and exotic. Next, please. As noted by scholar John Efron, Jewish Orientalism encompassed, quote, "a kind of inner neocolonialism in which there are good and bad Jews, advanced and primitive communities, and which the larger goal is a vivified and respected Judaism whose adherents would be find a welcome place within a non-Jewish state, unquote. I argue that this mixture of fantasy and fascination, together with contempt and revulsion, made inroads in the American Jewish consciousness and became an impediment to their feelings of solidarity with Jews in Morocco, wrapped up as they were in romantic and exotic notions of the Arab East, together with a certain loathing due to the degradation of Jews in Morocco, as reported in the newspapers. And now to the actual encounters of American Jews with Moroccan Jews during World War II. Excuse me. After the fall of France in 1940, next please, tens of thousands of European Jewish refugees escaped from the flames of the Nazis and their Vichy collaborators to the fire escape of Morocco in groups and individually, by intention or by chance. Many were stranded in Moroccan harbors for days, weeks, months, and even years, until they were unable to board ships from Europe en route to the Americas. You can see this scene very clear in the opening of the film Casablanca. Helen Kazaz Benatar, an amazing Moroccan Jewish attorney of Casablanca's westernized Francophone Jewish elite, responded immediately to the refugees' cry for assistance in July 1940, and not only came to their assistance herself, but also established a committee to assist foreign refugees in Casablanca, and later a countrywide network of communities. Together with the support of community leaders as Estée Levy, Jules Nataf, and Celia Bengio, she organized the urgent financial, bureaucratic, and medical assistance so sorely needed by the refugees until their departure, most often headed for the United States. Benatar and her work are finally receiving recognition, and just 6 weeks ago, on Yom HaZikaron Shoah, Israeli Holocaust Memorial Day, the Committee to Recognize Heroism of Jewish Rescuers During the Holocaust, created by the B'nai B'rith World Center in Jerusalem, posthumously awarded her a Jewish Rescuers citation. As the number of refugees increased and the communal resources of the Jewish community in Casablanca became even more strained, having to deal simultaneously with the local Jewish population suffering from anti-Semitic Vichy legislation and the overall deprivations of war. In August 1940, Benatar contacted American Jewish communities and organizations requesting funds, and soon received responses from the JDC, thus paving the way for its future activities in North Africa. Benatar became the de facto representative in Morocco and began a long relationship with them as their representative in Morocco and later for all North Africa, and acted as their legal advisor for Morocco until 1953. However, as we will soon see, she was never fully accepted. She also established cooperation with the American HIAS, the European offices of HISAM, and later the Philadelphia-based Quaker American Friends Service Committee, the AFSC, at a time when cooperation, however desperately needed, was not always forthcoming from the male leadership. Due to the limitations of time, I will only briefly mention the European refugees in Morocco, on whom I have written and lectured extensively, and the social, political, and diplomatic aspects of wartime in Morocco and their Jewish context. Next, please. Which have recently merited a second round of excellent research published in the last couple of years. And here are but a few of the English publications. On November 8th, 1942, more than 3 years after the outbreak of World War II, more than 2 years after Vichy rule in Morocco and the arrival of European refugees, and 11 months after Pearl Harbor, Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, and the first major American military operation of the war, brought North Africa to the forefront of daily news. Next, please. Just a month after Operation Torch, Casablanca suddenly burst onto the screen with the fortuitously timed debut of the Warner Brothers film. The movie generally evokes the wartime romance between the American expatriate Humphrey Bogart and his former lover, Ingrid Bergman, the mystery and the intrigue of the East, while all the while reinforcing stereotypes of the Arab and his Oriental market. The fact that nearly all the refugees arriving from Europe were Jews was carefully laundered out. The film did, however, bring Morocco to the attention of American Jews beyond the military reports. As American Jews discovered Moroccan Jews in the midst of World War II, the prior erratic context and bits of information were forgotten or more likely never really absorbed. The hundreds of American Jews arriving as soldiers and chaplains in the U.S. Armed Forces were varied in background and outlook. But the one thing held in common was their lack of knowledge about Moroccan Jewry, and their preconceptions, which brings us back to the magic luster of the exotic names of song and story, vis-a-vis the realities found in Morocco. Next, please. Lieutenant Samuel Aronson, a Jewish American soldier, wrote home, "It's not what I expected, dark and mysterious." As the military situation stabilized in the spring of 1943, free time allowed some of the Jewish soldiers to form personal ties with local Jewish families. Next. Jan Kulik Belin has recreated such encounters through her father's letters home. Henry Bauer, in his memoir of the war archived in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., wrote, "While stationed in Casablanca, we were handing out candy and chewing gum to the local urchins, and it was a shock when the more aggressive ones would point to a few youngsters standing on the side and tell us, 'Don't give them anything, they're Jews.' Of course, their remarks had the opposite effect, and our newfound friends took us home to their families. For the rest of our stay in Casablanca, we would spend many Friday evenings with one or another of these families. Although their lifestyle was simple and their small huts sparsely furnished, they were happy to share their local specialty, couscous, with us." It seems, however, that these experiences were all but forgotten once they returned home, as were those of the refugees who passed through Morocco, eclipsed by the enormity of the war, the horrors of the Holocaust, and later the challenges of post-war life. As a result of Operation Torch, American Jewish organizations were able to expand their activities significantly. Facilitated by Benatar, representatives of these organizations began to visit Morocco, and while focusing on the refugees, they began to learn about the problems and needs of the Jews in Morocco. In February 1943, some 3 months after the invasions, Dr. Joseph Schwartz, then director of the European headquarters of the JDC, toured and met Kazaz Benatar in person. Summing up, he wrote, "This report would not be complete without a tribute to the fine work accomplished by our refugee committee," my emphasis, headed by Madame Benatar. "She is a person of energy, devotion, and great executive ability. And with the moral and financial support of the JDC, it is felt that something concrete may be accomplished in alleviating conditions," end quote. American Jewish leaders and JDC staff, as Schwartz, and social workers recruited by the JDC, as Kurt Peiser, Max Perlman, and Donald Hurwitz, visited during that first year, and many, many others during the next decade. They all had to deal not only with the inflexibility and bureaucracy of the U.S. Army and local authorities, but also with their own ignorance of the realities of Jewish life in North Africa, and I contend American stereotypes of the Orientals, which put mental blinders on them. A November 1948 report states, For one who has never visited the Orient, the first contact with the poverty of the Jews is a veritable shock. Next, please. Before my departure for Morocco, wrote Judah Shapiro, head of the JDC Education Department in January 1949, I had read many reports and had seen many people. Actual contact with the scene, however, had a startling quality, for the whole environment is emotionally strange. Morris Laub, who became the JDC country director briefly for Morocco and Algeria in mid-1949, after his work in the camps in Cyprus, reported in blunt terms, quote, "You have the spectacle in French Morocco today of finding Jews who, to an untrained eye as mine, seem to be Arabs." Next, please. Journalist Hal Lehman described his first visit to Morocco in Commentary magazine. In the Melach, the Jewish quarter, when I first saw in 1943, I could find little to remind me of Jews. To the average eye, including mine, the Melach people seemed creatures not merely from a different longitude, but another era, remote, barbarous, unredeemed, end quote. Next. Rabbi Herbert Friedman, the newly appointed executive director of the UJA, reported on his 1953 tour. Traveling, talking, looking, learning, making our way through this fascinating and troubled part of the Jewish world was like exploring a different planet. It hardly seemed related to areas of Jewish life with which we in the West are familiar. Some JDC workers were more forthcoming. Quote, "I had never seen Jews from an Arab country. They spoke only Arabic. They looked to me exactly like Arabs. I said to myself, what do I have in common with these people? I don't have any common language, any common culture. We don't look alike." However, noted a JDC report from 1948, this cannot be said of all Jews. Next. Representatives of American Jewish organizations began a dialogue with the Francophone Western elite of Morocco as Benatar. It is these leaders who participated in international Jewish conferences and hosted American Jews on their trips. But the Americans were interested in seeing the primitive, downtrodden Jews, not leaders, next, who looked, acted, and often thought much like the American Jews. The American JDC brought American staff to Morocco, and with a short time virtually took over communal institutions and organizations by strength of the financing so sorely needed. In a process similar to that analyzed by Maud Mandel in her study of the JDC in post-war France, in her excellent study entitled Philanthropy or Cultural Imperialism. There were tensions. A veteran JDC staff member I interviewed spoke of the inherent pressures and friction which country directors had to navigate. On the one hand, the firm belief in the JDC ideology and policy of instituting American standards of social work and an efficient central communal administration for all. On the other hand, there are American client donors who wanted to see the misery and the results of their dollars. And finally, the vibrant, active, multi-layered local Jewish communities. These tensions can be illustrated by a discussion on publicity at the annual 1950 JDC conference in Paris. Veteran JDC staff member and the country director for Morocco, William Bine, a Polish-born and naturalized American, pleaded for VIPs, quote, "because we have a lot to show." However, Benatar, attending the conference as a delegate, responded, quote, "Nobody will be happier than I that North Africa will be made to the American people who up to now don't know what is going on there. However, we must be careful." Next. I will never forget a JDC article which stated that hunger, misery, and oppression reigned in the Melach of Casablanca. I was called to the residence, the government authorities. Hunger and misery did not worry them, but oppression? What was the oppression? And I was asked to explain why the JDC has used the word expression, unquote. The rebuttal, next please, found in the correspondence was that the JDC was to give the American Jews what they wanted to see: the exotic, the primitive, the extreme poverty, juxtaposed with the miracles which the dollars they had donated to the JDC had wrought. I apologize for the poor quality of the photos, but these are from the JDC digest that was widely distributed, and many pages have these juxtapositions of the pictures. Next, photos of the local leaders remain closed in the archives. Benatar was gradually eased or squeezed out. During the war, she was our representative, then a JDC delegate, and in 1953, introduced as a close JDC friend and colleague for more than a decade, but still recognized as, quote, perhaps the outstanding authority on Jews in North Africa, unquote. Although she returned to civilian life as it was lauded in March 1952, it seems that the climax came in early 1953, the week before her 3-month speaking tour in the United States, coast to coast, on behalf of UJA. Next, please. By invitation of Dr. Joseph Schwartz, as noted, wartime director of the JDC European headquarters and admirer of Benatar, and then in 1953, executive vice chairman of the UJA. After changing her plans in order to host a group of UJA VIPs at the request of Schwartz, William Bine, the country director, bypassed her, and the group left Morocco without ever meeting Benatar. In concluding, this project re-examines and expands upon the groundbreaking work of Yaron Sur, who studied the activities of American Jewish organizations in Morocco on the backdrop of rising nationalistic sentiments in the country from the viewpoint of Moroccan Jews, as well as that of Avi Picard, whose work focuses on the strategies and funding of Aliyah for Morocco in the mid-1950s, much of which was facilitated by the JDC. However, the picture is not complete without examining the attitudes and perceptions of the third variable of the equation, American Jews and their representatives. Although several thousand Moroccan Jews had immigrated to Israel immediately after its independence in 1948, the mass migration of hundreds of thousands of Jews from Morocco was yet to come. Concluding her address at the 1950 JDC conference, Benatar pleaded, "We arrived too late in 1940 to save the Jews of Europe. Will we also arrive too late to save the Jews of North Africa?" Next, please. In 1953, Rabbi Herbert Friedman, the newly appointed executive director of the UJA, raised the question in the minds of many Americans who wondered why the UJA money should be used in North Africa. Quote, "Why should we be concerned about these Moroccan Jews? Haven't they always lived in squalor and poverty? How far can we go to rescue every remote remnant of Jewish population?" Unquote. Friedman's answer reflected Zionist terminology, the JDC policies of cultural imperialism, and the Oriental other. He continued, here, a direct quote with emphases of mine, "My answer to this comes from the heart. I am convinced that these people are good human material. They have been ground down under the brutal poverty and ruthless Arab oppression for centuries." Next, "Miracles have been wrought in the 4 short years that organized help has been brought to them." Note, he only includes the years that American staff had opened up a JDC office in Casablanca. "Let us not be dismayed at the temporary burden," he continues, "of the temporary burden it represents, but let us rejoice rather that there are those who again can be gathered in to enlarge the fold. Why be concerned about them? Simply because they are ours. Why did American Jews have to be convinced to help Moroccan Jews? This story must also be put in the larger picture of post-war American Jewry. After more than a decade of concentrated efforts on behalf of European Jews, often ignoring their own needs, most American Jews were looking inward, back to investing in the American Jewish communities, as well as integrating Holocaust survivors into American life, and of course, support for Israel before and after its independence. Nevertheless, Lehman entitled his final article in the 1953 series in Commentary, North American Dilemmas for American Jewry, and advocated for American Jewish responsibility overseas versus the postponed domestic needs. So why did Moroccan Jews remain a side story? I argue that any information outside preconceived images fell on virgin territory, not grounded in the experience of most American Jews, and subordinated to the notion of the Oriental other. Next, please. Moroccan Jews were remote and exotic, as well as wretched and, yes, inferior, which simultaneously reinforced feelings of American superiority. These perceptions of the other continued to be marketed, as in the title of a popular 1951 book written by Lawrence Resner, The Eternal Stranger, The Plight of the Modern Jew from Baghdad to Casablanca, and in full-page ads of the annual UJA campaigns from which these pictures also appeared. There was for sure much misery, and it was no doubt presented in order to wring more funds from donors. With their before and after photos, American Jews reveled in taking all the credit for Jewish institutions, often erasing or ignoring existing initiatives, however problematic. As William Bine boasted, there was someone to come and open their eyes, and that someone was the American Jewry through the efforts of the JDC, which did indeed improve the lives of thousands of Moroccan Jews. Next, please. With the deterioration of the political situation in Morocco, leading up to its independence in 1956, rising social tensions and anti-Jewish riots, American Jews were once again called upon to aid Moroccan Jews and once again discovered them. The JDC redoubled its efforts and assisted in the mass migration of Moroccan Jews and their settlement primarily, but not exclusively, in Israel. But that is another complex, fascinating, and multifaceted story for another time. Next. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. We have a number of questions, and I will go. Well, the first question we received is not really a question, it's more of a comment. It is, I assume you're aware of the Arnold project that virtually reconstructs synagogues and other Jewish sites in North Africa and the Middle East. I thought you would be aware. The second question is whether you could provide a little bit some historical background about the origins of the Moroccan Jewish community and whether the Jews, the person who asked the question heard that the Jews who settled in Morocco were integrated with local Moroccans well before the entrance of Islam. So I know that this is not really your time period, Michal, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, of course, it could be, a series of lectures on the Jews of Morocco. But basically, some of the first Jews, it seems, by archaeological finds, came shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple. So we're talking about many centuries. And yes, they were in all of Morocco. And to what extent they assimilated or, they coexisted with the local population. With the expansion of Islam, they became a recognized minority among the of the Jews, but they lived under the Pact of Omar, which had had many restrictions, so that the Jews were clearly noted as secondary citizens, as you would say. After the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews in the late 14th and in the 15th century, there was a huge wave of Spanish Jews who came to Morocco. Most of them settled in northern Morocco and central Morocco. So we have a stratification of Moroccan Jews, those that have Spanish customs in the north, a mixture of those Spanish communities and the local communities in the central part of Morocco, and those that were the indigenous Jewish communities in the south. So we have a mixture from the very beginning. As to coexistence, it had its ups and downs. It often depended upon the local leaders. There were times when there were many of the prohibitions were very strictly enforced, and there were many riots against the Jews and rioting in the Jewish quarters. There were other times when they coexisted very well next to each other. There was no what you would call in the United States assimilation, because the Muslims didn't want to marry with the Jews and the Jews didn't want to marry with the Muslims, although some, especially women, were abducted and Islamized. And then we get up to the colonial period, which I gave a short few sentences, when Jews were actually very happy to get the protection of European countries, because that freed them from the oppression of the Islamic laws and the government of and the rulings of the Sultan. There were also, as I mentioned, the European countries were using them as what they also saw natural bridges between Europe and North Africa. And there were many merchants, Moroccan merchants, for example, in Manchester and other places, so that there was increasing contact, and with the Alliance schools, increasing Francofication of them. So that's sort of like a short history in 3 minutes.
Very good. We have a few other questions, so I think it's good to have to give more than 3 minutes to each answer. Was there a difference between the Jewish connections with Moroccan Arabs and the indigenous Berbers, Amazigh people?
As you get into the smaller and smaller towns, especially in the Atlas Mountains, you have more contact, because there weren't enough. The Jews weren't in a specific. They weren't separated as much in the smaller and agricultural and farming areas, so that there was a lot of symbiosis there, which is not always to say that they were always loved, but there was much more interaction, a great deal of interaction. You hear even today from the older generation many stories of mutual assistance, etc. But everybody knew their own place. So yes, there was more, but to a certain extent, it was dependent on the type of economic and social existence they had vis-a-vis the cities and the economic structure of urban centers.
Right. The next question is actually two questions. Was France and French Jews more welcoming to Moroccan Jews in allowing immigration and in providing aid? I don't know, more welcoming, I suppose, than the US. Was the JDC involved in coordinating this and with the American Jews in post-war? So I suppose that the second question is, was the JDC involved in coordinating the immigration of Moroccan Jews to France, maybe during the 1950s, 60s? That's my
Um,
understanding of the question.
There's a couple of different things. That the JDC was involved in Aliyah together with the Jewish Agency and the Aliyah and the government departments dealing with immigration. But they didn't deal with the migration itself, but more focused on the health issues and improving the health and maintaining the centers for potential immigrants before they left. And once they left, it was more or less the under the auspices of the Jewish Agency. But once they arrived in Israel, once again, the JDC had many social services in Israel. As to France, I'm not really the expert in the JDC and the migration of North African Jews to France, but as France was still coming out of the war experiences, the JDC was heavily involved in assisting immigrants, whether they be from North Africa or whether they be from Eastern Europe that had been, or those that had been in DP camps. For many Moroccan Jews, they spoke French. They knew a French culture through the Alliance schools. So maybe it was easier for Moroccan Jews from the urban centers who had gone through 2 or even 3 generations of Alliance schooling to be absorbed within the framework in France, the same as those who went to Montreal during the same period. And the JDC did have some involvement, but sorry, I'm not the person to go into that in detail.
Right. I mean, the JDC was involved helping Jews from North Africa who settled in France during that period, providing assistance, housing, etc. But this is another.
The question was whether it was different than the assistance they provided for immigrants from other places to France. I don't know whether they made the
I don't think that was the question. I'm not sure that was the question, Michal. So the next is a comment. Thank you for the fascinating talk. A comment. It was not only American help. A large number of American GIs, Ashkenazi, met and married young Moroccan Jewish women and brought them back to the US. I personally know of 3 such family members in New York, Detroit, and Jacksonville. So this was
yes, I know of this. I mean, there were tens of cases I know of. I'd be very happy if that person would write to me and have contact to find those. I found more that married Americans and then eventually settled in Montreal. But this did happen. It was very interesting. I had a fantastic, real fascinating interview with a 96-year-old woman who was originally from the city of Mogador in Assuera in the southern coast of Morocco, and then with her family in early 1930s settled in Casablanca. And in Assuera in Mogador, the Anglo-Jewish Association was very active and had a school and supported a school there. So she and her sisters knew excellent English. And she said, oh, after the Americans came, we had fun. We were going to, they had lots of work in the offices of the American Army. They were going to parties with the American soldiers. So yes, there was interaction. And then the two or three examples I gave of American soldiers meeting up and going to Jewish homes. So yes, there was, but most of the soldiers stayed there only for a few months, and then they continued and were sent to Italy and Europe.
The next 2 questions are somewhat related, so I will ask them at once. It's from 2 different members of the audience. The first one is, I was wondering whether perception of Algerian and Tunisian Jews was any different. And the second one is, can you please compare images of North African Jews and Ostjuden from East Europe in the eyes of American Jews? So again, 2 questions about perception. Is the perception of all North African Jews the same? And how different is the perception of North African Jews versus Eastern European Jews?
I didn't go deeply into the examples in Algeria, but it's basically the same. But the fact that Algerian Jews, what most Americans and American Jewish leaders didn't even realize is that the political status and economic status of many Algerian Jews was very different, because Algerian Jews had French citizenship beginning with the Cormier Decree in 1870. So by 1940, you're talking about already 3 generations of French citizens who went to French schools and were very much integrated within the French society. Then they got this total, slap in the face when they were defranchised with Vichy rule. So that although many of the same stereotypes exist, there are fewer for Algerian Jews because they were more Frenchified. Also, the country director and all of the JDC staff for Morocco and Algeria together were based in Casablanca. So there was much more contact with Moroccan Jews. As the Ausjuden versus the image of the Ausjuden, most of the research on Orientalism and the Jews deals with Europe, with British, French, and German attitudes towards the Jews, and Jews, they're talking about the Ausjuden, the Jews in Eastern Europe. So that you have this kind of inner Orientalism that they were talking about. What I'm trying to do is to tease out the American Orientalism of American Jews, and only after I complete that picture, we can compare the two, because as I brought also 1 or 2 quotes, European Orientalism and that of the Jews in those countries was very much affected by the colonial context, the colonial hierarchy of those countries, which didn't exist for American Jews. So first, after I complete my study, then we can do a comparison, but it's definitely in the same ball game.
Okay. Now, the next question is, thank you for a fascinating presentation. In your view, in terms of local perceptions on American philanthropy, how much has changed since then? I know it's not your topic, but I'm interested in your views.
I think there's still very strong echoes of it when you see, sometimes say American Jewish tourists come to Israel and they want to see where the Sephardic Jews or the Mizrahi Jews, and that's a whole nother question of what they're called. You still hear a lot of comments about it and a lot of derogatory concept, or that they're lower class. Other people have worked on this topic, and I think with assimilation of Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews in Israel, it's slowly waning. I think with the large number, thousands of North African Jews that have migrated to the United States, often via Israel, as people are meeting each other face to face, I think it's waning, but I think to some extent it still exists. Prejudice.
We have another question. How many European Jewish refugees were in Morocco? How did JDC assist them?
We really don't know the number of refugees, and the numbers documented go anywhere from 20,000 to 60,000. So you can pick a good figure somewhere around 40,000. But the problem with the documentation is sometimes they talk about the refugees in all of North Africa, and there were some in Algeria as well. Sometimes they talk about at the initial stages, Benatar was assisting all refugees. And there were some non-Jewish refugees, as you have in the story of Casablanca. There's also actually a good number of refugees that escaped from, that had fled from Spain, that were Spanish Republicans and had fled Franco's rule. So after things became more established by mid-late 1943, the ASFC, the Quakers, and the Red Cross were much more involved, such that the Quakers and the Red Cross more or less were dealing with the non-Jewish refugees, and Benatar and the JDC were dealing with the Jewish refugees. But the numbers, we don't know if it's Jewish or all, we don't know if it's Morocco and Algeria or just Morocco. So there were tens of thousands. Exactly how many, I don't know. Benatar left all her archives from the war years in 1978, just a year before she died, or 1977 actually. She transferred all her files, something like, I don't remember, maybe 50 cartons of files, to the archive, the Central Archives of the History of the Jewish People in Jerusalem. And we have hundreds and hundreds of lists of refugees. They haven't been digitalized at all, but we can go through, and through this we can see how many at different places, because they had refugee centers, they had to find housing, they had other problems. So we don't have, and those again were those refugees that came in contact with Benatar's committee and the JDC. But there are others as well. Most of them had some money in order to get there, or they were sent by Hisam or Hayas. But once they get there, their money very quickly disappeared. There were others that were had more money and more connections. For example, Sigmund Freud's daughter-in-law and granddaughter were in Casablanca for several months, and they stayed in the home of one of the community leaders. And they, of course, had different experiences that those that came with nothing. And Isabel can certainly add on those that were in the international zone of Tangier and in Tetuan. And that was also a different story because of the political situation there.
Yes, there were, I mean, in Tangier, there were about 1,500 refugees during World War II. Now, the next two questions are Moroccan Jews considered Sephardi or Mizrahi? That's...
It's a question of terminology. I mean, it's kind of funny to call them Mizrahi, which means east, when they were so far to the west. They're west, actually, they're south and west of France, and they're certainly south of Poland and Russia, so you call them Western. I mean, so they're called Maghrebim, which the Maghreb is the western part of the Islamic world. So they're North Africans. And some of them, as an answer to the question on the history of them, some of them are clearly from Sephardic ancestries. Others are not. Some it's their intermarriage between the two. So it's a question of where is your question coming from or going to, or questions of terminology. If we deal with demographics in Israel, usually we'll talk about North Africans as opposed to Asians, which deal with Iranians and Iraqis and Syrians, Turkish. You have some that are, they have a census that deal with European and Afro-Asian countries, all the Afro-Asian countries from Morocco to Hong Kong. So it's a matter of terminology, what the person wants, what the presenter is talking about, you know, what terms you use. So this is why I use North African or Moroccan specifically if I have the information to specifically deal with Moroccans.
And the second question is somewhat connected to that. Is it whether the Spanish and Portuguese Jews who came to Morocco and entered the Jewish life, they are completely merged, I suppose, with the local Jews?
This is what I tried to explain. Those in the northern part of the country more or less took over and those non-Spanish merged into or integrated into the Spanish Jewish customs and tradition and legal jurisdiction. Those in the center of the country during the 16th, 17th, 18th century, there were two communities in each of the communities. There was the indigenous local communities, and there was the Sephardic Jews. By the mid-19th, early 20th centuries, it was, again, one community, and some of the customs had merged. Some families kept more pure, as if you would say, Sephardic customs or local customs, but the communities in general had a merging and a blending of legal jurisdiction, of traditions, of songs, foods, that sort of blended.
The next question, and I think this will be our last question, although I'm very tempted to ask you a similar question. How much presence does the Alliance still have in Morocco?
Does the what?
How much presence does the Alliance still have in Morocco?
It's still there to a certain extent, but many of the other schools. Today, I was trying to find the most recent figures I could find for Morocco were already like 6 or 8 years ago, where there are 2,000 to 2,500 Jews in Morocco today, most of them in Casablanca, most of them older, so that the Alliance has influence through those generations that were educated by the Alliance. Today, I really don't know whether, I think there still is officially an Alliance school that's supported by the JDC, but I'm not really sure. I really don't want to say. There are other schools, or schools from Otsar Torah that's sort of connected to the more Lithuanian Jews. There's the Chabad schools, but all in all, there aren't that many children.
So I will ask you the last question, Michal, is do you think that this Orientalism, this perception of the Moroccan Jews was uniquely American? I mean, is it something that other Westerners who were involved with Moroccan Jews also had, like French Jews, like people who work for the Alliance Israélite Universelle? Do you think that they also had those kind of prejudices? I know this is a bit maybe out of your own research, but if you have any thoughts.
They definitely had similar prejudices, but the Alliance came in order to have, regeneration, to bring them into the fold of Western life. And European Jews were so involved in the colonial enterprise of their countries that it's sort of difficult dividing between, say, their French views and their Jewish views, but it definitely impacted their perspectives. But they were also using, for their mutual advantage, the Jews in Morocco and North Africa, both North African Jews and European Jews. So there was sort of mutuality above it. The difference of American Jews that they weren't involved in this colonial enterprise, or not in North Africa at any rate, so that they didn't have this very strict hierarchical separations of people. And where the European Jews were trying to cultivate and enlarge this westernized elite, the JDC was using them to their advantage when they needed local leaders, but they really weren't interested in them. They were interested in changing the whole communal structure, not as the local elite saw, but as the American Jews having secular administrative communal organizations. So that it was similar, but it had its very American, American tones to it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Michal, for a fascinating lecture. Thank you very much to all of you for attending, and we hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thank you.